Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the SciSim School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harary. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's an honor to be with you again. I'm Charlie Harary, and I am with the one and only Dean Wasserman. We're talking about the 3 R's. Just for a second, can you take us back through the 3 R's for those that are joining us for the first time, just to get the overview again?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking, Charlie. Great to be back with you. The 3 R's capture one of the most important, momentous decisions that founders tend to blow, and that they have to think a little bit more deeply about before they make those decisions. The first of the R's is the relationships. Who are you going to tap in terms of the friends, family, acquaintances, coworkers? How are you going to find co-founders or other people to be involved with you in the startup? Second of the R's after relationships is the roles and decision-making. How are you going to allocate the roles and the titles? How are you going to decide collectively on key decisions that you are facing? And then today, we get to get into the last of the 3 R's, the rewards, both intangible and tangible. How do you allocate those within the startup? How do you have a foundation that you're building for the founding team that's going to be a robust one that'll enable you to be able to have a really good foundation for good relationships and a productive way that you can build the venture?
Amazing. So let's delve into the rewards. That's a hugely touchy topic, as everybody wants a lot of the rewards, and even just knowing what to give out and how to give out and how to make it appropriate. I mean, that's real stuff that people struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go to an actual founding team. This is one of my favorite case studies that helps paint one end of the spectrum and some of the dangers that you might face along the way. I assume people are familiar with Zipcar. Zipcar, the car sharing service that has been around now for almost 2 decades. Zipcar was founded by 2 co-founders. One of the women was named Robin Chase, and their co-founder was someone she had gotten to know socially. Their kids shared a daycare center, and during drop-offs and pickups, they would get to know each other. They'd be chatting about all kinds of things in a variety of realms. One of the ones that they chatted about was a trip that one of them had just recently taken, vacation that they had taken to Europe. And in Europe, one of them had seen a car-sharing service and liked it on 2 dimensions, one of them as a business idea, but also the 2 of them had discovered that they shared a green streak, help the world, help society by being able to reduce pollution. If people could be sharing cars, taking some off the road, being able to have ways in which there are going to be fewer of needs for parking spots, being able to have other ways that car sharing might be able to help the environment. That was a twofer for them of being able to have a business and a socially conscious one. And so they decided, let's go and explore this. Let's see about how we might be able to bring our talents to being able to build a car sharing service in the States. Robin had heard a horror story about how an equity split, the way that founders were splitting the ownership within a venture, had blown up that team. They had come to fisticuffs over it, and in the end, because of that, they had decided, let's go our separate ways. We're not going to go and found together. And so Robin was panicked about that becoming them, and so decided, let's go and head this off at the pass. Let's get this out of the way. Let's make sure this isn't going to be a problem for us. And she's thinking about what to do, and she defaulted to what is actually the most common way in some ways that founders do it. She defaulted to not even discussing it, to punting on a discussion about who is worth what and how should we really be splitting it. And she just shook 50-50. She proposed across the table, let's do the equal split, the 1/n rule. And she said that, this is the way that I think maybe we can be able to avoid having this blow us up. And she proposed it. Her co-founder accepted it. And Robin said, smartest handshake I've ever had. I've been able to avoid this pitfall that might be caused, that I would end up being, great, we're all set for being able to go and conquer the world. And so in some ways, we can see that this is a natural inclination that we all have, that we might default to that kind of split. We can even see within the Talmud and the Torah that this is a natural inclination. If we think back in the Talmud to the beginning of the tractate that's called Baba Metzia, the first opening of that, the first case study, if you will, of Baba Metzia, Shnayim Oxim Batalas. 2 people are both grabbing for an article, and they're both claiming ownership over it. And the declaration there is split at 50-50, that you should have, half-half, that they're going to be doing it. Right now, as we're taping this, we're heading into Pesach. The Passover season is here. And if we look in the Torah as the Jewish people were getting ready to cross through the Red Sea, as Pharaoh was trying to convince his people to go after the Jews, if we look in Rashi, and he quotes the Mechilta on this, he said the way that Pharaoh went and attracted them was saying, I'll split it 50-50 with you. Any of the spoils that we get, you're going to get half of them. Radically more generous split than they're having there. That's our natural inclination, is for us to go and split it 50-50, and yet we'll get into some of the research that suggests that is hazardous.
Well, that's the question, right? I mean, clearly you're setting us up for the truth. Two founders before a company, you would think that's for sure the way to go, 50-50. So where were they wrong?
So where they're wrong is where things went after that. Robin threw herself into the venture, blood, sweat, and tears, going and crafting every part of the business plan, going and parking lot by parking lot, wresting from them a precious spot to go and put her zip car, doing everything that it would take. And her co-founder didn't even join full-time.
Oh, wow.
Didn't quit her day job. And Robin, when she was reflecting on it as this was emerging, she said that my co-founder is gaining equally from my blood, sweat, and tears.
Right.
There's all sorts of angst when she came, visited my class, and was talking about the experience that she had. You could see it eating her up in her face, that I am throwing everything into this venture, and the way that we split it, A, 50-50, and B, that this is the split that's going to be there regardless of what is going on in the venture, that is what was eating her up and really causing some major distraction and pain within the venture. And it highlights a couple of the dimensions of the things when founders are going and defaulting to it. First off, in my data, 73% of the founders split within the first month of founding. Think about how much is unknown at that point.
Right.
Founders are focusing on the rosy view of the world. When we go and conquer it, that is the point at which it is the heights of uncertainty. And yet that's when they're going and deciding on this very momentous, how are we going to split the ownership? And when you're doing it during those very early days that the almost 3/4 are doing it, it is the best that you might be able to do to go and split it 50-50, because we really don't know who's going to be dedicated to this venture, who's going to be contributing which skills. We don't even know our business model yet, let alone who's going to be contributing what roles and who's going to be doing the heavy lifting. Then going forward, as we're going to scale with the venture, who's going to be able to keep up with the demands in a very fast-growing venture. None of us have been founders before. For Robin and her co-founder, we don't know even a lot of what are the challenges that we're going to be facing. And so you are telling yourself the rosy view of the world, ignoring the pitfalls, ignoring the risks, and putting in stone, is relatively speaking, what is going to be that the equity split going forward because of it.
So, I mean, don't you need to have that conversation early to get people to start working? I mean, a company begins, there's no money, there's no cash flow. A lot of people that engage in startups are not using the cash they need. Either they don't have it, or their current job is paying for their life. So many times startups are really they're cash poor in the beginning, and so all you really have is equity. So wouldn't that be the only way to go forward, is to start to figure out where the equity splits? Otherwise, why go to work the next day?
No, absolutely. You have to be able to give someone some clarity about how big is this carrot,
right? So
that person will want to jump off. The thing is that Robin went and gave a big carrot to her co-founder.
Right. Too big.
It was, too big with how things transpired, but there also wasn't the incentive to really come on board. It was that this is the equity stake that you have regardless of whether you are full-time in the venture, whether you're playing a leading role within it, whether you are creating some real value within it. And so there's two sides that I like to break up the equity split into two.
Okay.
One of them, don't avoid the difficult conversation that we might not be equal in this, that we might be contributing different amounts of skills, and avoiding the real difficult discussion about it's very possible that I'm going to be more valuable than you or vice versa. Go and tackle those difficult discussions early on rather than punting on them. But also acknowledge that there's lots of uncertainties that we still have. Don't set it in concrete. We call it a static split, the way that Robin was going and doing it. 50-50, regardless of where we're going to be going with the venture. Have a bunch of discussions about prioritizing what are the uncertainties that we still face, what are the risks that we are going to be facing, And if those risks come true, how should that be affecting us within the team? How should that be affecting the ownership that we're going to be splitting? Being able to take a much richer cut at being able to see what are the scenarios going forward that we should be planning around, and then being able to have those be able to adjust in a dynamic way rather than the static split, being able to have dynamism that you're going to be able to adopt within the equity split arrangement.
So in this case, what should have happened is they should have sort of sat down and said, listen, in order for us to accomplish this, we anticipate these many things that have to get done, these many roles that have to get played. What do you do? What should I do? How much time you're doing it? How much am I doing it? And then from there, look at it and go, okay, what's the right split based on the role?
Yeah, so now we can revisit one of the tools that we had laid out earlier in our prior podcast in terms of being able to do the team planning that you want to have, but this is where you can drive it all the way down to what the equity split should be. So you should be creating a list of what are the most important things that we need to be able to do as a team in order to be able to succeed within this venture. That's your checklist. Go through, and we talked about in the pre-founding, being able to prepare yourself. What are the unchecked boxes that you might be able to use the luxury of time to be able to prepare for those? As you're now sitting down with your co-founder, what are the things we can check off in terms of what each of us is going to be doing on the high importance list of the things that we should be doing there? And then be able to start allocating that importance to each of them. For the business side of the venture as opposed to the technology side, this is how much of the value is going to be created on the business side. This is how much of the value is going to be created on the technology side. When it comes to the one who's going to be providing the seed capital, this is how much value that's going to be creating. Take your 100% pie of the value that's going to be created, allocate it to each of those most important things, and then as you're taking a look at who's going to be doing each of these things here, that's going to give you, as you add up all of that person's contributions, Robin doing the business plan, going and getting the parking spots, etc. How much is that worth in terms of the value that we're going to be creating within the venture? And then when you go and total it up, what are all of Robin's items going to add up to? What are all of her co-founders' items going to add up to? That gives you the starting point for how much is the contribution really going to be for each of them.
What do you do for situations in which the answer is, let's just go take on the world together? I don't know, like I'll wash the dishes, you'll take out the mail, you'll be the business person. Like so many founders begin with, let's just figure it out. Entrepreneurs have this way of, we'll figure it out and we'll take on the world together. So are you suggesting that approach in general when it comes to equity is a bad approach? The idea of, let's just figure it out and the world will be what the world is, but we'll be in this together. Like when a husband and wife get married, right? They don't really know how to raise kids. So they're like, let's just figure this out. And then it starts and they're like, holy cow, you do this, I'll do this, let's figure this out together. So to me, many startup founders are like that. They don't know what the baby's going to look like. They for sure don't know what the teenager's going to look like. And they just assume that whenever that comes, they'll get it. Is that, you're suggesting not to do that? To be able to create more clarity beforehand into these sort of the corporate functions, and not to jump into this, baby raising type of model?
So when you are leaping in with the mindset that you were talking about before, we're going to go and conquer the world together. You're just looking at the rosy view of the world.
Right.
And you're ignoring that there are a bunch of pitfalls that you're going to be facing.
Right.
One of the key things you have to build as co-founders and also as a couple when you're getting married is the ability to tackle the difficult. The ability to identify pitfalls, be able to discuss what we're going to do when we hit the pitfalls, be able to build those muscles, the difficult conversation muscles, and the other things that are going to enable you to do that. Just tackling that in one realm, and in some ways, the equity split one is a really good one to be doing it, is going to set you up with much stronger muscles for when the uncertainties hit.
Got it.
It would be the equivalent of saying, when our son, when we give birth to our son, we're going to assume that he's going to be able to get into every college that he ever applies to. And let's not go and plan around, well, what happens if he happens to be weak in math and that's going to harm him from being able to get to the college that he wants to get to?
Right.
Well, let's have a plan around how we can build his math skills. We'll be healthier for being able to do it. The baby will be stronger for being able to do that. And you as a team are going to be a lot better if you've been able to build those muscles. There's going to be all sorts of unknowns that you're not going to be able to plan around, but being able to build the muscles to deal with the unknown together is one of the key pieces that is going to be missing, and that by doing this well, that you can be able to build that.
And I think that's the key point here for those that are listening, and this is important if you're starting a company or if you're at any stage really in a company. I think one of the key points from this exercise is, A, to get clarity as to what the corporate functions are so that you can figure out who's doing what, so you can hold them accountable, right? So if one founder has in his mind that his value is vision, so he's going to roll into the office whenever he wants and dream on a whiteboard, and the other person's like, no, your role is operations. Like, just creating clarity as to who's doing what. And even if you have to take personality tests and have conversations about what your skills are, that's an important beginning. But I think maybe as important to that is starting the relationship off by having really difficult conversations. Like, this to me is a critical piece to the relationship, which is when you talk about rewards, it's real. Like, people avoid rewards all the time because it's too touchy. But you can't run a company if you're always avoiding being touchy. Because what will happen is, if you hit success, it'll get a million times worse. So it's so much better to be able to create a relationship of openness. And if you have to use rewards to do that, between the clarity on the corporate functions, even if it's not perfect, and the clarity on the rewards, and to your point, you could always say, when we hit this inflection point, we can readjust, or when we get this investor in, or whatever it is. But that, to me, from whether you're starting a company now, or you're in the middle of I know people that are 20 years into a company and they're at this stage, right? They're still at that place of they're scared to dance. They're dancing around conversations. They're dancing around corporate functions, and they're even dancing around rewards. So I think it's critical to just on so many other levels, and even just the rewards.
No, absolutely. And I think that the general approach that we're talking about is one that can be applied also to the other R's. Planning around what are the pitfalls when I'm co-founding with my best friend, being able to have discussions around what we're going to do around that, being able to plan around the pitfalls with the decision-making and the roles piece of it and things like that. The overall structure, this is actually when I was early on starting to study this, ran into a one-page founder agreement that, to me, captured how we would be able to approach all of these R's and being able to think through it. This goes back to my beginnings as a computer engineer. When I saw their one-pager, I saw it as a series of if-then-else statements. Mm-hmm. If scenario 1 happens, that was the rosy scenario, then this is what our equity split is going to be. Else, if that doesn't happen, but instead scenario 2 happens, that one was the middling scenario, not rosy, but not disaster, then this is what is going to happen when it comes to the equity split.
Wow.
Else, if the disaster scenario happens, then this is what is going to happen in terms of our equity split. The disaster scenario was that one of the co-founders doesn't join. It was actually the idea person, the most central one. But the other co-founders realized that we face a big risk with this co-founder. His name was Ken. The risk was that Ken was actually becoming a first-time father as they were founding. None of them had founded before. They didn't know in terms of work-life balance, in terms of being able to found a family at the same time as you're founding a venture. Is Ken going to be able to stick around in the venture? And they also happened to know that Ken really liked his day job. And so they were wondering, is he really going to sacrifice the given and the paycheck just as he's got the family starting off in order to leap into the unknown and take on that risk and everything. And so fortunately, they surfaced it. They didn't avoid the conversation. They had actually, going back to a prior episode, we talked about coworkers where you've already ironed things out. The three of them had worked before together. They didn't start off as friends. They started off as coworkers instead and had built a little bit of the difficult conversation muscles as professionals. And so they put it on the table with Ken and said, what happens if this happens? Let's plan around this. And it also goes back to one of the core things about don't avoid the risks. Don't go into, avoid acknowledging that they are there. Prioritize them. Have ways in which you can tackle the top risks on your list. You will, A, be able to be a lot lower risk because you've tackled them, but B, you'll be able to build those muscles when it comes to that. And so it's not where I am telling founders, go and create a set of contingencies that looks like the phone book.
Right.
That is a really long one.
No, right.
Build the skills around prioritizing, build the skills around taking the risks and things like that. It actually brings to mind, I just heard it for the second time, so I think it's probably a real story. It was from Rav Shai Schachter recently about the Chavetz Chaim, that there were a couple of co-founders who came to him and showed him their founder agreement and wanted to know, what does the Rav say about how we've gone and thought about this venture. And the Rav's looking through it, and they tackled just about everything under the sun and how it's going to affect the business, every possible thing that would be happening. The Rav hands it back to them, the Chavetz Chaim, and he says, this is horrible. You've completely missed the biggest thing here. They were trying to figure out, we nailed every single last contingency that we were looking at here. And he said, you've completely ignored that every day we're supposed to be anticipating Mashiach coming.
Yeah.
Where is the Mashiach clause in
great.
this?
That's great.
And so I'm not saying you should go and do the extensive, thing that they had done, covering everything, but at least tackle your top 5. At least take those risks off the table. You'll reduce a whole bunch of the risks. You will set yourselves up to be able to deal with the unknown a lot better. And along the way, you'll also hopefully make the Chavetz Chaim happy by including a contingency like that.
And for those who are listening, you could always go to foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com, and we will send you the sheet. So this way you have it. You can always check us out. You can email us at foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com, and we can always send you that template. But I think just this exercise in itself is critical for founders, because being able to look at contingency scenarios vis-a-vis where the business goes also allows founders to stop thinking that their idea will become, $1 billion venture by spring. But just to make sure that the listeners are sort of capturing what this idea is, being able to slow down and create contingencies around rewards and equity splits, and being able to create a little bit of dynamicness or dynamism to what is possible almost forces a more difficult relationship and forces scenarios which will allow founders to take their business and what is required more seriously, and ultimately the value of each other more seriously. And I think that's also critically important, right? People have just confirmation bias and all the biases we have. We all think we're greater than we are. 80% of the people, are above average. So the idea that there's a real conversation about your worth, that can get sticky, but at the same time, if it's couched in corporate function, it can really clarify a lot of stuff early on.
Yeah, and one of the key things is also not having the avoidance of those conversations means that you get very far down the road before you realize we're not good at fighting well. There's all sorts of ways that by front-loading the good fights and being able to see, do we have what it takes to really be able to go through the fire together, the earlier you can be able to test that and start building those skills, the better for you, so there isn't the rude awakening that's down the road, like what happened with Robin Chase. In the end, Robin decided that wasn't the smartest handshake I'd have. It was actually the stupidest handshake because of how I approached it, because how I was avoiding these things.
What did she do in the end?
So in the end, she had to go and continue with being the equal to her partner. There are all sorts of things. They went through the first round of financing. These are also one of the key things, a recurring theme about a lot of times founders decide, even if I blow it, we'll have the giant eraser from the sky come down and enable us to hit the undo key. That giant eraser might be our investors, that they're going to go and force us to re-architect our agreements and things like that. Robin's first round of investors didn't push back on the equity split. They did not act as the undo key. Wow. And also, it causes all sorts of heightened tensions when you've got the investor forcing it. Robin, go back and tell your co-founder that she needs to give up some of her equity. Right. That's not a recipe for being able to have smooth relationships and being able to have the venture be able to continue in a productive way. Right.
Also, Robin goes back and has to make her co-founder do something she hasn't done until now, even when they're getting a cash event, which is hard. People get used to living off the fat of the land, and now for Robin to create some kind of a real urgency, it's harder and harder.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's just get into some of the details around the dynamism. That's in some ways a little bit of the art here. Yeah. The biggest art, I think, is the not avoiding difficult conversations, but the second art is how to think about bringing something that's a little bit more dynamic to it. We talked about the scenario planning that actually in the one-pager that I had seen is where they concretized it by using the different scenarios for it. There are other things much more common, actually. There's something that's called vesting. Vesting is where you earn your stake over time as you're involved in the venture. Mm-hmm. And that's the most common in my data. That's about 80 to 90% or so of all of the vesting is time-based vesting, where depending on the amount of time, you have to think a little bit about tying that amount to the real value creation. Unfortunately, founders default too often to just a knee-jerk 4 years, and that's regardless of the venture and its evolution. It could be a very slow-growing venture. It's in biotech. It's going to take us years to be able to prove the concept. We need people to stick around for longer than the 4 years versus a social media startup where
Right.
within a year it's going to be. And despite that, the data show that it actually is a rock solid, almost everyone doing 4 years. You have to think a little more deeply about
Wow.
that. But still, going and adding in some element of dynamism in any form to me is a huge new thing that you're going to be doing there. So it might be the time-based one. You're still involved in the venture, and then you can earn it back, a quarter of your equity stake over the 4 years that you're going to be able to get to it.
I saw something similar. I wonder what you think of it, which is in one of the companies I was involved in, they created a profit participation that mimicked the equity in order to incentivize the founder, the new hires, if you will. But it didn't convert into equity until you reach that certain both milestone of activity and years. This way, you can get the benefit economically right away, but you don't have that. You're stuck in as equity until you've proved it out.
Yeah, no, so what you're talking about there is a hybrid approach to it.
Right.
The other version is milestone-based vesting, which is what you said that they incorporated in there.
Yeah.
There's some ways in which that can work great for some teams.
Right.
This goes back to when we're talking about the roles, and is it distinctive roles that you have? Does each founder have a clear domain that plays to their strengths and things like that? Then setting up the milestone-based vesting can be very good. Right. Being able to have ways in which this milestone, you are tied to it. When we hit it, as long as it's objectively clear that we've hit it, then you earn your equity.
Right.
That can actually be a very powerful incentive for them to do it.
Right.
There's some ways in which the time-based vesting is derided as paying for a pulse. The person just keeps living,
Right.
and then they're able to keep earning
Right.
their equity.
Right.
And so you have to be able to understand the profile of your team, be able to understand the risks you face, and then be able to tailor it to it. But to me, the biggest piece right there is not going static, going dynamic, having some way in which the way of the world, the expectations are not just the rosy one, but that you'll be able to adjust to some kind of way in which there's going to be some pitfalls you might hit.
Have you ever seen the undoing of equity? Have you ever seen that the concept is you can I've just recently been involved in this where the idea was you get this much equity, but if these things happen, you stop showing up, or what ends up happening is we buy your equity back at a discount to X. So there's a little bit of a downside protection that in case either you walk out or you do a bad act or we can't get you on your phone, whatever, the company can always recoup it.
Yeah, so in the scenario-based one that I was talking about, the one-pager with Ken as the idea person, that was what the worst-case scenario was. If Ken is not on board at all, then these are the terms by which we buy back his equity.
Got it.
And so that's one way to do it. It happens to be psychologically and for the dynamic of the team better for someone to earn things over time rather than you grab it back from them.
Right.
Like you're taking a chunk out of them as opposed to you're earning it over time. So the dynamic is a little bit different when it comes to that. But that is one of the ways, as long as it is set up from the beginning, like with the one-page agreement that they had, for being able to have the worst-case scenario turn into reclaiming that equity.
Right.
So what you were just talking about now, Charlie, is exactly what the third of the scenarios was in the one-page agreement that they had with Ken. They were talking about in the last part of it, the worst-case scenario of Ken doesn't join at all, and the condition was that we would be able to buy back his equity.
Uh-huh.
And so that's how they're able to reclaim it. A key thing, though, is psychologically is very different. Being able to incent someone to keep contributing to the venture and you gain something, as opposed to you own this and we're going to take it back from you if you don't perform within the venture.
Totally.
And so two very different dynamics there, but the same kind of way that you might be able to accomplish being able to recover, taking back that scarce equity that you can only give 100% of it away, being able to have that gunpowder back, not having dead equity on the books, and being able to reuse it to replace Ken is what they were trying to do within that venture.
So let me see if I can sort of capture it and do some takeaways, and you'll tell me where I'm right and wrong. Key point here is rewards are a critical piece to this venture. Don't avoid the conversation, right? Number one, identify the corporate functions as early as you can. Figure out what has to happen, who's going to do what. You don't know what's going to happen, but you know at least the roles and responsibilities to know who's going to be handling it. So that this way you can start to have the conversation as to who's going to be responsible for what. Create a more dynamic process in the rewards. Create ifs, if-thens, or else. Allow yourself to live beyond the static approach towards we're doing this forever, and allow scenarios to play out. Better to front load the discomfort and create all these different scenarios than to sort of push back, wait for the company to get any traction, and then have problems. And always remember that you have ways to play with equity through profit conversion, through maybe buying back, but it's always better to have the uncomfortable conversations and let people grow with equity than to be less confrontational early on and have to somehow readjust.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That was an awesome. Thank you for that. That was a really insightful, important conversation. I know that people will be able to benefit from. Remember, you can always contact us at Founders Dilemmas Podcast. foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com. Questions, ideas, insights, we want to hear from you. This podcast is for you. We don't want you to make the mistakes that so many companies make. And we would love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you next time.